Hello and welcome to the podcast with myself, Matt Davey, and Connor Godfrey. In this podcast, we speak to the chief football writer at The Athletic, Oliver Kay. Ollie talks everything surrounding England's infamous 2010 World Cup campaign, including Fabio Capello, questionable squad selection, and essentially where it all went wrong, really. Finally, a big thank you to Ollie for joining us, and enjoy. Prior to the 2010 World Cup, what do you think that Capello got right in qualifying that, say, Steve McClaren got wrong sort of prior to Euro 2008, where England famously, lost to Croatia, the Scott Carson era? Because Capello came in and he had quite a job on his hands. Did you think that he did something different to sort of get the spirits up again? Because it's quite a job.
Yeah, I mean, he wouldn't really normally be regarded as a sort of motivational, sort of put smiles on faces type of coach at all. He's very, very serious. You don't want to sort of generalise and pigeonhole managers too much, but he's very much of that sort of autocratic Italian style. I mean, he was regarded more as an autocrat than Arrigo Sacchi, who went before him at Milan. He came in, and one interesting thing I think with the history of England managers is they always seem to sort of flip flop from one type of manager to the next. So they went from Glenn Hoddle, who was very sort of cerebral, but maybe not maybe not as good on the human side, to Kevin Keegan, who was more of a sort of tub thumper. Then they went to Sven-Göran Eriksson, who was obviously a more sophisticated type of coach and a lot quieter, very different character to Keegan. Then they went McClaren, and I think with the appointment of Capello, they wanted to go in completely the opposite direction to McClaren. And McClaren was very much a sort of coach manager rather than a manager coach. He was very he was very sort of familiar with the players, and everyone. I think some people, with hindsight and with retrospect, sort of cringe a bit when they think of him sort of referring to JT and Wazza and Bex and Stevie G and Lamps and all this kind of thing. Capello was the opposite of that in terms of the way he managed them on the training pitch, the way he managed them in public, the way he managed them in the dressing room. It was just a very, very serious, almost sort of austere approach. But also he got some of the tactical things right immediately. I mean, McClaren didn't ever really seem sure of quite what the right system was. He didn't seem how to get the right blend in midfield. Gerrard, Lampard, etc. And Capello felt, well, he looked at it and he decided, well, I need Gerrard in the team, I need Lampard in the team, but I'll just put them in different areas of the pitch. So he played Lampard deeper with generally Gareth Barry. And he played Steven Gerrard in a sort of loose left-sided role it was loosely a 4-4-2, but Gerrard had a lot of freedom, and it worked really, really well in qualifying. And that was one thing I really wanted to make sure I got across in that piece, was how well it had gone in qualifying, and how a team that had really struggled against Croatia in the previous campaign, losing to them on both occasions. They beat Croatia, a really good Croatian team, 4-1 in Zagreb with a Theo Walcott hat-trick, and 5-1 at Wembley, which I think is possibly the best England performance, probably the best England performance since that Germany game back in 2001. It was a brilliant performance, and that's why I began that piece in The Athletic by talking about the next morning, the morning after, and how positive and incredibly optimistic the mood was after England achieved qualification in such style. And at that point, it just seemed that Capello could do no wrong, really.
And then going sort of into the World Cup, Capello had quite a task picking his squad. Well, he had a couple of injury worries. As you say in your piece, he issued SOS calls like to Jamie Carragher, Ledley King, and Paul Scholes, as well as considering the likes of Owen Hargreaves, Bobby Zamora, and Phil Neville, who all had some sort of injury come the end of that season, and even looked into Gary Neville and Sol Campbell. The list is pretty endless, really. Would you like to talk us through why Capello was sort of contemplating these names?
Well, I mean, I was, very much involved in reporting on that process at the time, and back in the March, they played a friendly match in March, and everything seemed to be sort of optimistic, and everything. Capello was talking about at that time about being fairly sure of the 23 names he was going to pick, and certainly sure of the 30 he was going to pick, and then it got to like the week before the provisional squad deadline, and I was speaking to various people around Capello at the time and saying, what's he going to do with the midfield, because there's this question mark over Gareth Barry's fitness, and it came out that he was planning to speak to Paul Scholes, and I was like, oh wow, really? Not, I mean, look, everybody knows Paul Scholes was a brilliant player, but by 2010 he'd been retired from England for 6 years, wasn't playing week in week out for Manchester United, and was being sort of phased out a bit at Manchester United. Wasn't the force that he was at his peak, certainly. So that was a bit of a surprise, but you could see the logic. I mean, why wouldn't you have Paul Scholes in your squad if you could, even a 35-year-old Paul Scholes? But then there was Jamie Carragher, who'd been retired from England for 3 years. And then there was Ledley King, who ended the season brilliantly at Spurs when they just finished in the top four. But there was a big doubt about his knee condition. He hadn't played for England for 3 years. There were doubts about Rio Ferdinand's fitness, because he sort of barely played all season. But he was the captain, so it wasn't a surprise that he was taken. But it was felt that maybe taking Ledley King would be a gamble when you already had a question mark over one of your other central defenders. And then it came out that he was looking at Owen Hargreaves. Now, Owen Hargreaves, again, really good player, but he had played, I think the previous week, he'd come back from Manchester United and played the final minute of their penultimate game of the season. And that was the only minute of football he played in nearly 2 years, since September 2008. So that suddenly, I mean, all the headlines about Owen Hargreaves that season had been, is he going to play again? Is his career over? His knee problems seem to be that bad. Manchester United were kind of aghast when they heard that Hargreaves was under consideration. Ferguson told Capello, look, his knee just isn't up to it at all. It's a non-starter. But the night before Capello named his 30-man squad, Owen Hargreaves was penciled in, and then Ferguson told him once more, look, this is you've got to forget about this. Hargreaves won't even be able to train. He can't play. So Hargreaves didn't go. Ledley King did go. Carragher did go. Scholes said no. And then, as you said, there were all the Bobby Zamora. There was, he played well in Fulham's run to the Europa League final, and there was this sort of call to him. He'd never been capped before, but he'd ended the season with an Achilles tendon injury. Needed to rest, I think, just to make sure he was still able to play the next season. So that didn't work. Phil Neville hadn't played for England for 3 years. He'd just undergone an operation because he had no expectation at all of being involved in the World Cup. Sol Campbell was considered at 35. I think Gary Neville at 35 was also considered. And it just seemed like this desperate last-minute frenzy where Capello must just have looked at it and thought, this squad isn't good enough. This squad, he liked the players in his first 11, but I think he felt that beyond that, there was not the quality and the experience and I think the mental strength to cope with it. And I think looking at it, you'd say he was possibly right, but he could have gone in a completely different direction and picked younger players. But as we will probably get to, the cupboard was fairly empty as far as young developing talent was concerned at that time. So, yeah, for me as a reporter at the time, it'd gone from being fairly sure about him picking people like Julian Lescott and Gary Cahill and Michael Dawson and people like that, to suddenly being, and Peter Crouch was established as an understudy option. Scott Parker as well. To then him going through this sort of bizarre last minute frenzy of sort of questioning everything he was doing and looking for, really looking for sticking plaster solutions, really, given the age profile of some of those players at the time. And it was already, I think, the second oldest squad at the tournament. It was the oldest squad England had ever taken. It was, I think, average age was, I think Milner was the youngest at 23, 24. And I think 12 of them were over the age of 29 or something like that. It was a really old squad. And Capello, had he got his way with Scholes and with Hargreaves and with, Phil Neville and Bobby Zamora and people like that, it would have been older still. It would have been, real, it would have been a crazily old team rather than a just crazily disappointing team.
So you mentioned the players he was rejected by. How much of a blow do you think that was to him, like individually and his pride? I mean, I don't know. I've never met the guy, but what do you think that did to like the team's morale?
I think for Capello, I mean, he'd left it very, very late to go back to. I mean, he tried Scholes and Carragher at various stages early in his tenure, and I think to go back to them. I mean, it would have been one thing to go back to them sort of March, April, saying, "Look, would you come back?" and making a sort of long, extended courtship type thing to try and get them back into the fold. But it was left very late. It was left to the final week or so. I think the first call to Scholes came from Stuart Pearce, and then the follow-up call came from Franco Baldini, who was Capello's sort of assistant but general manager, really, rather than a coach. And so, look, if he'd been desperate, if he'd been wanting to sort of put his feelings on the line and put his emotions on the line, he could have gone to them direct. I don't think you can claim it was that big of a surprise or that big a blow to be rejected by Scholes. And then, Jamie Carragher did say yes, and as he told me for this piece, he said yes partly because he was so desperate to work for Capello. He'd heard great things about him, not just from his time in England, from Stephen Gerrard and people, but Carragher grew up admiring that AC Milan team with Baresi and Maldini and so on, and it was so he was desperate to play for Capello and sort of accepted for that reason rather than for the prestige of playing at a World Cup. But in terms of the morale, I mean, I would say it already put a couple of noses out of joint. I think the fact that Jamie Carragher was brought back in and Ledley King was brought back in, and having had played no part in training, having played no part in the qualifying campaign. I think had there been more of Paul Scholes, I mean, nobody's going to begrudge missing out to Paul Scholes, but I think if there'd been more players brought in having not played any part in qualifying, having been retired from England for 3, 4, 5, 6 years, I think it would have created a bit of ill feeling. But this is one of the funny things with that squad. There did seem to be a real sense of hierarchy within the squad. I mean, you had the first 11 and the stars, and then the players below that didn't really seem to sort of fancy their chances. A lot of them, didn't seem to fancy their chances of forcing their way in or of making an impression on Capello. It just always seemed like Capello liked his first 11, but sort of grudgingly tolerated the players beyond that, which is, again, possibly why he went looking for short-term solutions.
Okay, so you mentioned in the article, one thing I got from the article when I read it was that Capello was very, like you say earlier, autocratic, very stuck in his ways. Do you think that, looking back on it, this was justified given his great record as a manager, or do you think he is something that he should have changed as he kind of went along and as the problem started to arise?
Well, I think the thing that has to be emphasised is that Capello's way of working had been extremely successful throughout his career. I mean, I keep mentioning Milan, but not just at Milan. He'd been successful at Real Madrid, Roma, Juventus. His reputation was very, very well earned, and I think confidence in his approach was very, very justifiable. I would also say that when he came in, yes, it was a bit of a culture shock for some of the players with how structured and regimented things were around the team hotel, how structured and regimented things were in training, and even silly thing. I mean, what always gets mentioned is that they were banned from having ketchup on the tables. As if that's as if that's a big deal. Look, that wasn't really a big deal. The big deal was just how kind of full on it was from the moment he named the squad in mid-May to the start of the tournament, which was it was about 4.5 weeks later, because England's group was one of the last ones to start. So between the squad getting announced in mid-May and the start of the tournament, they had a week in Austria in a sort of quite remote Austrian village up in the mountains. Nothing really to do there. Very full-on fitness sessions, morning and afternoon. They then came back to Wembley to play a game. Then went back out to Austria for more of the same. Even by the probably midway point of that first week in Austria, I was hearing things from players in the camp saying how kind of relentless and how kind of dull it was. I think everyone had really admired the Capello approach when it had been, based around short preparations for qualifying matches and friendlies and so on. I think for those players who were out there, it suddenly felt like this was going to be a real slog, even to the point where they went out to South Africa. And because there was this 4.5 week build up, and it was just, every day double take. Well, I'm exaggerating, but I think the feeling was that there were an awful lot of sessions. The players had a long, hard season. They didn't really get any time with their families before they went away to the World Cup, for good. And it was, I mean, obviously Capello's way of working had been very, very successful, but I wonder whether, when you're doing international football, whether there's a happy medium to be struck between sort of full-on training at the end of a long, hard season, and just sort of easing them back in gradually and letting them have a bit of a rest. And Capello didn't want to do that, and it was very much a sort of club manager's approach to international football. I don't think many international coaches do it that way, where it's really, really, really full on for 4 or 5 weeks before the tournament. I think when Capello was preparing for Euro 2012, which he eventually didn't take charge of, he was prepared to he was planning to make things a lot more relaxed, in terms of letting them have a bit more time off, not having that sort of relentless build up. And I think he did ease certain things as the tournament went on. There was, to use a silly example, they were allowed to catch up before one game, because I think he got to the point where he thought, the players just need to be liberated in some way and feel like this isn't a prison. So not only was the catch-up on the tables, they were even offered before one of the matches, they were even told, look, you can have a beer tonight if you want, which sounds incredible. But I think it was Capello recognising how wrong he had got it to that point. And I think, it was, and it's easy for a journalist to say he got it wrong because the players have complained that he got it wrong. But I think even the subtle changes he made during the tournament would tell you really that it was a bit too full on. And if the complaint, or one of the complaints about Sven-Göran Eriksson at 2006 had been that it was all a bit too much, too laid back, players seeing their families every day and all that kind of thing. I think it went a bit too far to the other extreme with Capello in South Africa. And yes, they are there to do a job, and he was absolutely right to say, look, this isn't a holiday, we need to be serious. But I think that in terms of managing their performance and managing them psychologically more than physically, I think they would probably have benefited from a bit more of a sort of a relaxed approach before trying to peak at the tournament and manage the sports science side that way.
Do you think that, because Capello had quite a strict regime, do you think that was used as a scapegoat by underperforming players? Like you mentioned, the families staying at different hotel, the banning of ketchup, sort of the long build up to the tournament with the camp in Austria. Do you think that was used as a scapegoat?
There's always an excuse with England. There's whether it's I mentioned in the piece that England, it's like Goldilocks syndrome. You get one manager who's considered too full on, one who's too laid back, one who's too strict around the camp, one who's too relaxed. There's always a complaint that nothing's right for the players, and maybe that reflects the reality. Maybe they've never really had the right manager. Maybe they never had a manager who was ideally suited to international football rather than club football in terms of that generation. I think Terry Venables was, managed them brilliantly at Euro '96, but maybe that was just a case of home advantage and things snowballing and so on. But it's I think excuses are used too easily, and that's, of the players I spoke to, a lot of them were trotting out this was wrong, that was wrong. Jamie Carragher, who's very blunt as anyone will know from his punditry or from his football career, he said, look, there were things that he felt Capello didn't get right, but at the end of the day, it's players. There was no excuse for performing the way they did. They just didn't perform well enough. There are reasons you can cite for why things didn't go quite the way they should have done, but he felt that a lot of it was excuses. Emil Heskey said the same. He said, you do hear a lot of complaints about that tournament. Oh, it was this, or it was that. Oh, we didn't have enough time with the family. He said, well, I would have liked a few more days off or afternoons off and the chance to just go and say hello to the family who was staying a few miles away. But it wasn't to be. And he said, but that's that it isn't an excuse. And I think of that tournament, you hear those things cited. You also, I'm sure we'll get to it, but there was a very, very, very glaring refereeing or linesman mistake in the decisive game against Germany. But I don't think that was an excuse either. I think England just didn't get things right at that tournament. I think the manager will look back and feel that he made mistakes, but I also think the players will look back and say that they made mistakes too, not just on the pitch, but we've heard players coming out subsequently and saying, looking back at that time and thinking we were so bound up in our own rivalries and the tensions between Man United and Chelsea, Liverpool, all competing for trophies, that they allowed that to sort of cloud over personal relationships, and that sort of soured the atmosphere in the camp a bit. And that you're not going to win anything with that type of tension in the camp. And maybe Capello with the sort of full-on approach he had was a manager whose approach kind of accentuated those tensions rather than maybe a sort of Ericsson, even McLaren type would maybe have softened the atmosphere a little bit. But look, I think there's so much blame to go around for that tournament that I think there's plenty for players, for manager, for the FA for being in a bit of a sort of leadership crisis at the time and not really getting hold of certain issues. And I'm sure some people would choose to blame the media. That's the norm, isn't it? So look, there's, I think anybody who blames just Capello or blames just the players or just that linesman who missed the Lampard goal in Bloemfontein. There's so much blame to go around.
They're definitely. I think the blame was passed around kind of nationally. One thing that I never really appreciated, I think, because I was about 11 at the time, so I probably didn't appreciate the kind of wider aspects of the World Cup. And one thing you allude to in your article is that some of the players thought that the media, like photographers, things like that, were too intrusive. As someone that was kind of around the tournament, do you think that kind of was a problem, or do you think it's just another one of those things that they sort of blame?
Well, it was something John Terry said in the months after he did an interview with the Daily Mail, and he said, you know, we would come back after training and we would see all the the clips from the other training sessions, and the Brazilian players were laughing, and Argentinian players laughing, all the Ghanaian players laughing. They felt they couldn't even smile on the training, even as they were doing their kind of warm down exercise, never mind the warm up exercise. They couldn't even sort of be seen to be smiling, be seen to be laughing, joking amongst themselves, because the mood was one of this lot are letting the country down. Now that does come from the media coverage. It probably also came, I think it was maybe accentuated at that tournament by the fact that it was the first Twitter tournament, and maybe people were more acutely aware of the public's feelings than they had been before. I think maybe sort of advances in technology meant they were less distanced from the newspaper coverage and the media coverage back home than they had been in Germany 4 years earlier. I think John Terry's actually right about that in some ways, that if you're just messing around on the training pitch and you're kind of, if there's a picture of you, if you're laughing on the training pitch, there will be loads of photographers. You'll hear the kind of whir of shutters being, I don't know the photographic terminology here, but you will hear the photo, all the photographers sort of clicking into action, and that those kind of pictures where they're messing about or having a laugh on the training pitch, that those can end up on the back page, and you do get certain newspapers or websites that will use any picture of anyone smiling on the training pitch as a sign of them not taking it seriously. I mean, that does happen in this country. Whereas I think I went to the Brazil camp in 2014 in Brazil, and I've got to say to John Terry and others, that is so much more full on. The media coverage of a lot of other teams is so much more full on than it is with England. But maybe there's something in the sort of, well, look, there is something in the Brazilian psyche, and that feels a lot more fun and much more laid back, and like you can relax, and people will appreciate people relaxing and so on. But I do think there's the pressure on England is enormous at times, because but it's no bigger than some of the other nations that they talk about. Sometimes I even feel like the pressure is less with England, because there's not the same sort of absolute astonishing fervour around the national team. I don't think. I mean, sometimes it happens around tournaments, but there's players sometimes feel that the national team setup is less intense in all but the sort of media glare and the number of people at press conferences and so on. So I know what John Terry was saying, but I do think it's slightly exaggerated. And I just think it was a fairly kind of joyless camp. I think even if there'd been no cameras there, I don't think they'd been laughing and smiling, because that was the impression we got. They weren't having a good time, and they were sort of worried about sort of being seen to be taking it lightly in front of Capello. I think that was more of an issue really than them worrying about people taking a photograph. I mean, that's I do think I found it slightly sad, and I knew what he was saying, but I think certain other countries there's far more kind of intrusive, full-on, intense media coverage, and with England, I think it was just, I don't know, it just felt like the whole mood around that World Cup was negative almost from the time we turned up in Austria. Never mind the time we turned up in South Africa. Yes, we were there every day, and yes, it did feel like a bit of a sort of joyless slog watching them train, and then sort of sitting in the media tent and waiting for a player to come in, and nothing felt upbeat around that tournament. And sometimes different players would come in and try to. I remember Joe Cole coming in and he's a lot more kind of full of beans and so on. But then he kind of got, it ended up being about, oh, why do you think you're not playing, Joe? And that ended up being a bit negative as well. So, honestly, the mood around that World Cup, it was so glum and so dark and negative that I don't think you could put it all down to the fact there were cameras there. I remember even before we went out to Austria for the first media day out there, hearing from one player via his agent that it's they're finding it tough out there. So it wasn't just the media coverage. I'm sure that media coverage didn't help, but it never does it?
We've sort of alluded to it already, but do you think there was a specific reason why there was a lack of young players, talking about who sort of Capello had to choose from? Do you think there was a reason for it? Because he seemed to be, he seemed to sort of show his frustration at there not being a greater pool to pick from.
Yeah, if you go back to, that time, it's a decade ago, there was there was an ongoing debate at the time about the lack of young English players coming through, and obviously there'd been this. I know everybody says it disparagingly these days, but that group of players who were known as the golden generation and great players, didn't do it collectively for England, but certainly did great things at club level. If you're talking about the ones who, Terry Ferdinand, Campbell, Ashley Cole, Gary Neville, Scholes, Butt, Beckham, Gerrard, Lampard, Rooney, Owen. It was Joe Cole as well. It was a really, really good generation. And then after that, I don't know whether that caused complacency in terms of youth development, or whether it caused some kind of struggle for other players to follow in their slipstream. But if you look at what happened after Rooney, let's say Rooney and James Milner, who were both, Rooney and Milner both broke in 2002 into first team football, both playing at a very high level for a very long time. But other than that, in their generation, not many players really got through. So if you look at those who really had England careers after that group, Micah Richards got through at a very early age, but didn't really kick on. People like Gabby Agbonlahor was very good Premier League striker, played a couple of times for England, but not of the same level. And then there were people like Glenn Johnson, Gary Cahill, Phil Jagielka, who had very good careers, but they weren't anywhere near that sort of level. And they also weren't people who were getting into the England squad from a very, very young age. And so you had this, there was basically a gap really. And it got to the point where I think it was probably, there's probably a sort of 7-8 year age group where there really weren't many players who were playing Premier League football, really weren't many players playing Champions League football at all, and really weren't many players who were of a level that you could say could even kind of fill the gaps for England. So they had this team of players in their late 20s and early 30s. Beyond that, there was Joe Hart, Glenn Johnson, Wayne Rooney, James Milner. Beyond that, there was, as Capello said at the end of the tournament, he said, there's Jack Wilshere. There's, I think he mentioned Gabby Agbonlahor. I think he mentioned Adam Johnson. The less said, the better. And then beyond that, you look at people like Jack Rodwell, who great prospect at 18, 19, didn't really kick on. People like Josh McEachran at Chelsea, great prospect, didn't kick on. And it was around that time when people in youth development circles in England said, look, we've got a problem here. We're just not producing enough quality players of the required level. And even the ones that we are producing, like Josh McEachran aren't getting first team football. And then someone like Jack Wilshere, who got too much first team football at too young an age. So it just seemed like, I don't know, the worst of all worlds, really. There was a real gap coming through. I remember Trevor Brooking, I think it was 2 days before that game in against Germany in Bloemfontein, said, look, we've had this great generation. We've got a lack of real young players kind of ready and ready to break into this England team. So when when Gerrard and Lampard and Terry and Ferdinand and people like that retire from international football, we might have some rocky times ahead, because there aren't really the players beyond that to sort of pick up the pieces and move on. And Jack Wilshere was the one for me who was, so promising in the year after the World Cup, but obviously injuries caught up with him. And I think Trevor Brooking's point was that it was going to be a tough first half of that next decade, and gosh, that it really was. The Euro 2012 was a struggle. 2014 was England were basically home almost before the tournament had started, and 2016, obviously Iceland, and even what went before that wasn't great. So I think in the FA's eyes at the time, and in youth development, academy coaches' eyes at the time, it was going to be a sort of there wasn't going to be a quick fix, and it was going to take a lot longer for the players who they saw real promise in, who had come through the elite player performance plan and more exposure to better coaching, etc. People like Jadon Sancho, Marcus Rashford, and Raheem Sterling, people like that. They were a lot further down the line, and it was going to be So for that reason, you could understand why Capello and indeed Roy Hodgson in the first couple of years of his tenure sort of clung to that the last remnants of that golden generation, because the youth really wasn't coming through at that time.
Yeah, that's very true. It's definitely a problem that I don't think we have now. Perhaps it's more the opposite, kind of big names that aren't there. So just going back to kind of the actual World Cup and the games, Rob Green, obviously the incident against the USA, and then the Lampard incident against Germany. Then you have John Terry kind of openly questioning the manager and causing rifts. Do you think that the public and the media use these quite big incidents to sort of paper over the cracks that actually was, they focused on these massive incidents rather than actually the problem, like the FA and the lack of youth? Do you think that was a problem?
Yeah, I think, you're in the media, we're always going to focus on incidents. The goalkeeping uncertainty was an issue throughout the build-up to the tournament, and maybe it sort of became a sort of self-perpetuating issue and or self-fulfilling prophecy in some ways. Obviously, the John Terry thing made a lot of headlines at the time. Wayne Rooney having shouting down the cameras, about the crowd booing, that made a lot of headlines at the time. And but I also feel that there was a lot of coverage at the time about just the total lack of chemistry on the pitch, the lack of chemistry off the pitch, the kind of the fact that they reverted to a Gerrard Lampard partnership in central midfield, I don't know, at least 4 years after that, seemed to have been written off and consigned to history. It was also a tournament where there was sort of stats and data available for the first time in a big way. So a lot of the media coverage, certainly my coverage in the Times, it would be quite analytical of the matches, and I think you can't just characterise it as just these series of flare-ups. The performances on the pitch were just nowhere near good enough, and maybe that was in some way reflective of the negative mood and everything else. I'm sure it was, but we'd gone through so many years of saying, 4-4-2 is not really, it might be a system that suits English players individually, but it doesn't really get the best out of them collectively on the international stage. It was and I talked earlier about that system that he'd used in qualifying with Gerrard in that sort of loose left-sided role, and because of the injury to Barry, it became Gerrard and Lampard, in that opening game against America, and it didn't really work. It was never really going to work. It was going to be a sort of papering over the cracks thing. Emil Heskey had done really, really well in qualifying, and I know people kind of look back at, what the comments on the piece was like, oh, I had no idea, or I'd completely forgotten Emil Heskey was still playing for England in 2010, but he'd been really good in qualifying and was really good alongside Rooney. Was probably a better partner for Rooney in some ways than Michael Owen, who still had a lot of public support at the time. But yeah, the performances just weren't good enough. And I think certainly after the Germany game, I think the inquests, yes, there was a bit about the cliques and about John Terry and about Capello had done this wrong, that wrong. But yeah, there were an awful lot of questions asked about, where are the young players coming from? Why can't England players, look comfortable in modern football in the way that they do at club level? It seemed like a new football was emerging at that time. With Spain had obviously won 2 consecutive tournaments. The Germany team was coming through, and the Guardiola influence was being felt, and you still had England playing this sort of analog football in a digital world. It was just it was straight lines football. It was unimaginative. It was hoping that an individual, whether it was Gerrard or Rooney, would take it by the scruff of the neck and do something rather than relying on a sort of coherent system. It really felt that much more than the previous couple of tournaments, in 2004 and 2006, it felt like everything was being questioned. The whole approach to developing players, academy level, how you integrate them into first team level, how you then integrate them into an England setup. It felt everything was suddenly being questioned, and I think to some extent that coming so soon after the failure to qualify for Euro 2008, it did really kind of prompt a reset, which we certainly didn't feel at the time under Roy Hodgson with England, but it feels like, that certain things were reset in terms of youth development and the way we kind of thought about the whole culture around the England team as well.
Okay, so we've spoken about your experience as a journalist there, and you kind of felt the mood of the camp. I don't know how, as a journalist, whether you separate your views kind of as a fan. If you are a fan of England, which you might be, you might not be, what was it like being that close to the camp and being a sort of fan? Do you, as a fan, do you sort of think, oh, this isn't going to go well? Or, what's that like?
I feel like some journalists sometimes get a bit too bound up in the whole England thing. I can get, a lot of journalists will regard an England game, an England qualifier as superior to, that they will feel that the 10 most important games of the season are the England matches. Now, I would always say the biggest Champions League games, biggest Premier League games are bigger than all but the very, very, very biggest England game, by which I probably mean a semi-final or a quarter-final, which doesn't happen very often. So I felt, I didn't really feel, I've never felt like I've been sort of emotionally bound up in England in the kind of unhealthy way that you're perhaps talking about. I was extremely happy and on a high when England beat Colombia at the the last World Cup. I know that felt like I was you know I did feel like emotionally involved in that, but I certainly felt like it was. Look, to be honest, I think the England team at that time made you feel detached from it. It was hard to feel bound up in it, but I didn't, but I wanted to see it in a positive light. I wanted to report it on it in a positive light, and it was just very. It was the first tournament I'd had where I was actually sort of embedded in the England camp. Obviously, not staying in same hotel as them, but staying, 10 miles away and going in every day and watching the training every day and go to the press conferences, speaking to contacts in the camp and outside the camp every day. And it's really full on, that whole experience where you're just reporting on one team around the clock, and you feel like any sort of, if somebody stubs their toe in training, you need to know about it. You need to be on top of it. You need to, I found it quite intense. And I think it's certainly more intense than the camps that they've had since in 2018, 2016, where it felt a lot more relaxed. But I felt like the quite a full-on experience. I was hearing constantly about dissatisfaction in the camp from different players agent, different coaches, different backroom staff. Everyone sort of seemed to be briefing against each other. So it was a fairly negative picture as well. And, the reporting was fairly negative just because to set out and cause trouble. But, we were reflecting the reality, which was uncertainty over the goalkeeping selection, sort of dissatisfaction over that uncertainty, sort of unrest in the camp, dissatisfaction with Capello, dissatisfaction from Capello. It was quite, it was just all very negative. And then it came to the matches and you're willing them to perform and get a result, because I think there's this misconception that journalists at a tournament want England to fail. I can tell you that is so far from the truth. Everyone wants to be. I mean, everyone wants to report on England doing well at a tournament. Even the Italian reporters and the maybe not the Scottish reporter who was with it at the time, but even the reporters from other countries who were asked to report on England, they just want England to do well. And but you can't ignore what's in front of you, so you can't gloss over poor performances, and you can't gloss over unrest in the camp. So I found it strange, but it was also a tournament where there was loads of bickering amongst the journalists. I think we were all kind of feeling slightly stir crazy as well. I think, as I said earlier, it was the first sort of social media World Cup, and there were kind of constant frustrations from some and uncertainty from others as to what was allowed to go out on Twitter, what was not allowed in a kind of very strangely policed world that you have around an England camp. And we were staying in this place, Sun City, which was just about 10 miles away, and it was full of casinos and golf courses, and it probably sounds like some people would think that would be the ideal place for a load of journalists to hang out. I don't play golf, I don't go to casinos, and the worst thing was, because we were kind of reporting around the clock, getting up really early, going to training, and then sort of reporting sort of all hours and having to do things to the website, and often not finishing till 10 o'clock, often not able to watch the other matches. And then it would get to like 10 o'clock, I'd finish work and everything would be closed, and it would be dark and cold outside because it was winter there. It wasn't, normally you'd be in a city, like based in Rio for the World Cup 4 years later, and I was based in Moscow for the last World Cup, and that was great because no matter what time you finished work, even if it was late, you could go out and find a restaurant. Whereas in South Africa, it was just a very different experience, and it wasn't even like we were having great nights out there. It was just really it was a really strange experience. So that when England were finally knocked out, we were due to go to Cape Town the next weekend to do the Argentina-Germany quarterfinal, and I just said to my desk, I'm desperate to leave. I want to do another match. Can I break out and do another match? So I got away and did Brazil and Holland in Port Elizabeth on the Friday, I think, and that just felt like being released from prison. It really did. It was so yeah. That's a long way of saying it was very intense, that tournament, and yes, it normally is, but I think that was more intense than most because there was nowhere to go in the evenings, and there was and it was dark and it was cold, and there was Twitter, and there were all these stories, and everybody was. It wasn't like one of those World Cups where everyone knows what's on everybody else's back page the next morning. Everybody was hearing different information from different sources, and it was, everybody was sort of having whispered conversations in a corner on the mobile phone. So from a journalistic point of view, it felt quite pressurised and intense from that point of view as well. It wasn't really fun until we kind of got away from Sun City and got to Cape Town and Johannesburg for the sort of semi-finals and final.
Okay. Just looking at how the sort of tournament mapped out for England, I mean, we all know, but so 1-1 draw with the USA after having a great start. Gerrard scores, you have the Rob Green howler. I guess the less we speak about that, the better, really. Then a 0-0 draw against Algeria that I think you described as one of the sort of worst England performances at a major tournament, sort of pre-Iceland at the 2016 Euros. Then the 1-0 victory against Slovenia, sort of spring back in a step perhaps. And then the 4-1 defeat against Germany, where I guess everything that could have gone wrong that game perhaps went wrong. The Lampard incident, was it over the line? Yes, it was, but of course wasn't given. In the grand scheme of things, do you think that Capello was lucky to stay in a job after that tournament?
There was certainly some of the reporters felt that Capello should have gone. I felt some sympathy with him over, I thought he'd made a lot of mistakes, but I looked around and, there was a lot of support for Roy Hodgson at the time because Fulham had just got to the Europa League final, and there was support for Harry Redknapp because Spurs had just got into the top four. I felt Capello wasn't the problem. I think he was he made a lot of mistakes at that tournament, but he was a good enough manager to learn from those mistakes. So I was one of those who was more pro Capello after the tournament and sort of saying, not even Capello has been able to sort out this is so why would we replace him with an inferior coach? And he did stay on, but I felt that I feel looking back he shouldn't have stayed on, just from the point of view that I just think he was never the same again. I felt like it just felt fairly joyless after that, and he got he had some enthusiasm when he got Jack Wilshere into the team and Ashley Young and Darren Bent, Scott Parker. He was enthusiastic about these changes, but I don't think he ever really. I don't think the relationship between him and the players was ever the same again after that. I don't think his relationship with the media or the public was the same after that. So I think the fact that he stayed on probably did. It was just a sort of. It felt like he was sort of staying on in a, that sort of extended caretaker role, really, while we kind of worked out what next. And when that issue came up with John Terry before the Euro 2012, it felt like the kind of issue that wouldn't have been a resignation issue previously, and that he kind of wanted a way out, and that the FA were kind of happy for him to take the way out. I think he stayed on too long, really, but I didn't. I think he was almost minded to resign after Germany, and maybe if the FA had accepted that, they wouldn't have regretted it. But yeah, I wasn't one of those who was saying he should be sacked. I didn't think it was a sort of sackable tournament. I just think everything went wrong, and as I said, the blame should have been cast far and wide. Some of it for Capello, some of it not.
You mentioned Roy Hodgson there. Obviously, had success with Fulham. They beat Juventus, which was obviously a great day for them. And then he takes over England. This isn't really about your piece. It's just a general question, I suppose. The 2014 World Cup, England picked up 1 point in the group stages. You know, they came home. Costa Rica topped the group, I think. I remember. Do you think he was lucky to stay? Do you think there was double standards to not get as much stick, or what do you think was the deal there?
I think the difference between 2010 and 2014 is that there was no expectation going into the tournament in 2014. I mean, we were asked to do predict how far England will get, and I said, they'll get knocked out in the group stage, which I know it's one of those things you're not meant to say as an English journalist. You're meant to say, they'll find it tough to get through the group, but yeah, that they'll do it, and maybe an honourable defeat in the quarterfinals. That's our level. I don't think quarterfinals was anywhere near England's level at that time. That was a weaker squad, I think, than the 2010 squad in terms of people being ready for tournaments. So you had Raheem Sterling there, but he was very young. Daniel Sturridge, again, first tournament. Jordan Henderson, those three had come off a brilliant season for Liverpool, but they were going into a system which it hadn't really developed. The interesting thing with Hodgson is that he kind of relied on those older players for the qualifiers, and Ashley Cole and Gerrard and Lampard, and it was a very, he I think Scott Parker played a few games with Gareth Barry. I can't quite remember, but it was a very, very old. It was an old team that he qualified with, and it was kind of they'd go to Poland and scrap out a 1-1 draw and scrap out a 0-0 draw with Ukraine. And I think he felt that by the time it got to the World Cup, he needed to do something different and move on some of those older players. So Ashley Cole was left out, and John Terry had obviously retired by then, and Rio Ferdinand hadn't got back in. It was a very unproven defence. I'm trying to think, who did they have? Leighton Baines, Jolene Lescott, I think.
Luke Shaw went, if I remember rightly. There's a couple of Southampton players.
Luke Shaw went as cover, yeah. But it was a much younger, unproven squad. It wasn't a squad that was proven at sort of Champions League level and elite Premier League level or international level. So yeah, I think, and they were in a much tougher group. I mean, it was Algeria, Slovenia, USA rather than Uruguay, Italy, Costa Rica. So I never saw England getting through that group. I was in some ways surprised they played as relatively well as they did in the first hour of the Italy game, which is probably the highlight of the tournament. But yeah, I think there was just a recognition when Hodgson was there that there's just no alternative really. I mean, I didn't think there was really a case for defending Hodgson after the tournament. I thought he got a lot wrong there, but I just didn't think there was an obvious alternative at that time. I mean, they could have gone for Sam Allardyce then. They could have gone for Harry Redknapp then. They certainly weren't going to go for Gareth Southgate then, because it was Gareth Southgate initially said he wasn't ready in 2016, never mind 2014. So it was just, it just felt like there was an acceptance of mediocrity really around that time. I think expectations were very low. I was never really convinced by Hodgson as an England manager, but I didn't really think there was a case for arguing for him to be sacked, because I just thought they needed to sort of work on trying to groom the next England manager. And I think people were looking at, maybe Brendan Rodgers would be a good idea. Maybe Roberto Martinez would be a good idea, someone like that. But you know, they were in better jobs anyway at the time. You know, the Liverpool job and the Everton job were better jobs than taking the England job at a time when it was, I'd say, probably about the least desirable it has ever been.